us this weekend. And it's really, speaking for myself, has been really enlightening. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation this morning as well. But just to let you know who those folks are, that's included the Engaged Mindfulness program with Living Well, and the Mosaic Center for Students of Color, the LGBTQA Center, and also the Rubenstein School of Environmental and Natural Resources. I looked it up. But also a number of folks kind of helped make this happen. The Provost, the College of Medicine, Critical Race and Ethnic Studies, Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, Integrative Health, College of Nursing and Health Sciences, Office of Professional Development and Training, Student Affairs, and Student Life. And I read that just as kind of a gratitude for all these different organizations and entities on the campus, really recognizing that this is important. This is saying it works. So think about how do we incorporate practices that help us interrogate the systems of oppression that play around us as well as within us, and how do we respond intelligently and thoughtfully, and in ways that again honor the collective but honor ourselves as well. And so really excited again to have Dr. That's a doctor. Lama is an off, what is that? Honorific? Yeah, Lama Rod. And just a couple things for those of you who haven't seen his bio. He's an activist, organizer, poet, and graduate of the traditional 3-year Tibetan Buddhist teachings of Kaigu Thabuten Choling Monastery. And he's also a core teacher with the Natural Dharma Fellowship in Cambridge and graduate student in Buddhist Studies at Harvard Divinity School. And through all this work and experience, really looking at the intersections of Buddhism, identity, and social change. And so I'll turn it over to you. So thank you very much.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming out. Some of you have been with me since Friday and longer. And y'all were troopers. You know, I was just telling someone that I don't think I would come to an anti-oppression training on a Sunday morning unless it was happening at a restaurant with mimosas. Then even then. So again, welcome. So this is our last event for my stay here, and I really appreciated being here. And I think this has been a really wonderful community, and I'm really excited about, just kind of having some conversations this morning. Mindfulness is a field that I'm relatively new to, but seem to do a lot of work in, like, suddenly. I bring my understanding of pedagogy, and the ways in which I've been informed around pedagogy actually comes from just many years of just working as an organizer and activist, and doing some working with young people, and then entering into Buddhist training and becoming a Dharma teacher, and really just trying to learn what it means to actually hold space in front of people, and all the different kinds of components that come to play when we're functioning as authorities, really, And it's important that we kind of use that language when we're talking about being instructors or being teachers, because under this role of being a teacher is the functioning of power. So all this is happening beneath the current, and we're not quite used to talking about that. So some of my training around power has to do with studies in leadership, and how leadership becomes not this noun. It's not we're not a leader. You're someone who is practicing leadership. So it becomes like a kind of a verb. It becomes a process, you know. And so what's happening when we're not being leaders is that we're being authorities, you know. So we have very complicated relationships to power and authority, you know. So if we look at some of this literature around power and authority, especially in psychology, you understand that like people really pretty much hate authority, you know, but we don't want to admit that, you know. But when we're in spaces and we are sitting with people and there's this, these roles have been laid out as teacher and as student, unconsciously there's a little bit of resistance happening, you know. And I've found it to be very beneficial to kind of bring that out in my work. You know, what's really happening, you know, because I used to always say how I'm like really hard-headed, you know, but over time, you know, especially more recently, I've been getting to understand it's like I just really distrust authority, you know, and that's just kind of naturally ingrained in me. And that's a lot of social conditioning that comes into that because I've been hurt so often by people in authority, you know, or people who are claiming to be leaders in some way, and how my best interests have not been held, you know, or taken into account, you know. So I think a lot of us are in positions of being instructors or teachers, or you have some position of authority, you know, that you're holding. It can be large, it can be small scale, but in any case, people are relating to us, you know, in this power dynamic, you know. So I think about all of this, and I bring that to the work that some of us are engaged in terms of mindfulness, you know. So mindfulness teaching, meditation teaching, even in my position of being more of a Dharma teacher, you know, a Buddhism teacher, religion, and I ask, like, what's really going on, you know, and how am I at one point really like pushing back against authority, but on the other hand, really enjoying my authority. You know, how do I actually, in certain terms, get off on it? You know, because everyone likes to be powerful. You know, so there's a complicated relationship that's already forming. You know, I don't like it when other people have power, but I love it when I have power. You know, it's very selfish. You know, as long as you don't have any power, then I'm fine. You know. But we all have power. So power is always there. You know, power is always a part of every relationship. So the question is, how do we acknowledge that? How do we become transparent around how power is being used? And how do we actually own our sense of natural power, you know, which is expressed through authority? You know? So authority isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's not this negative term. Authority is important. Authority helps protect. Authority helps keep things in order. Authorities help us to solve problems, you know. Whereas leadership is something that we have to engage in to inspire people, and to inspire ourselves to handle issues and problems that aren't so easy, that aren't so black and white and dualistic, you know. So we talk about adaptive problems. So we need to be adaptive to meet certain problems, and leaders emerge to practice leadership, to do that work. So this is kind of an overview, you know, pretty much. And what is so important as a teacher, and I was trying to model this. I'll try to model pedagogy as I go along, but I'm doing like 3 different things at once, so we'll see how far I get with that. But one of the main things that I practice as a teacher, it doesn't matter if I'm teaching Dharma or if I'm teaching mindfulness, I try to cultivate an awareness of who's in the room, you know. So people come to the door, and often we just don't think about who's really with us in the space. And that's something I really try to think about, like who's here, where are people coming from, what are you being influenced by? You know, what are your narratives and storylines that you're bringing into the space? And actually, how can the ways in which I present myself and teach and offer mindfulness or Dharma, how does that contribute to actually ignoring you or rendering you invisible? You know, that's one of the first acts of oppression that begins on the onset, is when we actually have no sensitivity, no awareness of who's in the room. You know, So that brings into issues of intersectionality. So everyone's quite complex. So we did some of this work yesterday, too. I would say extensively, maybe not. But we engaged in exercises that helped us to actually disrupt our assumptions, about who we thought people were. So I can look at people and I can say, oh, you look to be, you have a certain race, you may be performing a certain gender, and I can go through a whole list of things, but actually that's my assumption, And as an instructor, as a teacher, what we have to do is say, okay, this is what I see, but this isn't necessarily the truth. So how do I start responding and working out of this potential that people are bringing into the room to be much more than what I think they are? So how do I actually hold space in a way that I'm acknowledging, I'm creating storylines based on assumptions, but also there's a real story happening beneath those assumptions. How can I actually teach from that place? So this work has been very evolving. And my first presentation of this work, I guess, happened about 2 years ago, or maybe a year and a half ago, and I called it Teaching from a Place of Intersectionality, which was really wordy. So I changed it. No one would really accept that title for this kind of work. But I really still like it. Teaching from a place of intersectionality means that I'm teaching in this really kind of spacious way where I'm taking all of these factors into account of who I am and who you are. So this is kind of dialogue that's happening. So I'm in my intersectionality, you're in your intersectionality. And we'll talk about intersectionality. I have many slides. And I hate actually doing slideshows, even though I requested this. Because I have to stay within a form, And if you know me, if you sat retreat with me yesterday, you know how at the end of the retreat became an Audrey Lorde retreat, right? And, I didn't know that was going to happen, but the book was in the space. And Audrey Lorde became my co-teacher. So with PowerPoints, I can't quite make that happen, even though Audrey was already in the PowerPoint before today. So Undoing Oppressions, Introduction to Intersectionality, Power, Anti-Oppression, and Mindfulness Training. So there's a lot to say there. So one of the goals today, to explore how oppressions function in the practice of mindfulness teaching by understanding intersectionality and power. So again, we're all very different people. We're coming into this space. We all have very different goals and a very different purpose. And I have to actually engage in a pedagogy that encompasses everyone. So I'm always thinking about, how am I gendering people? How am I making assumptions about class and race? And how am I actually moving into teaching different particular identity locations? So essentially what that means is that some of us are really much more comfortable teaching a specific person. So some of us are, if we're female identified, we're much comfortable teaching other women and being with other women. Sometimes I find myself being more comfortable within communities where there are more people of color. You will get a different presentation if there were a majority people of color in this space. Or you would get a different presentation if there were more queer identified people in this space. So what that actually means is that my identity and how I present always shifts depending on who's in the room. And you have to acknowledge that. You just simply acknowledge that. And you simply ask yourself, okay, in what spaces am I most comfortable? And that's okay. But at the other end of that, we also recognize that often we don't have a choice. So if you're like a college teacher or a professor or something, you don't have any say in who signs up for your class. You get who you get. Unfortunately, some professors don't know how to deal with that. that level of diversity in the room. And we've all been in classes, I think, where we've had professors and teachers who are just like, kind of like not in tune with that reality. So some of the questions that I'd love to start with. So what are your goals with this session? What do you need to feel safe? So safety is really important, but also being uncomfortable is also really important. So being uncomfortable and being safe are not opposed. You know, they're not in opposition. Rather, that we can feel safe and also feel like really uncomfortable, you know. But if we're feeling uncomfortable, it doesn't always mean that we're unsafe. So how do we determine that for ourselves? You know, so we get this uncomfortable, and often we just go to this place of saying, okay, this isn't a safe space for me. I'm really uncomfortable. This makes me feel weird, you know. So I attempt to create this space where we can actually determine the difference between these two things, and how do we challenge ourselves and also trust the space in which we're being challenged, you know, because once we get shoved a little bit, then we start feeling, oh, okay, this isn't, and that's how we avoid transformation and change. You know, we avoid transformation and change because we're attempting to avoid discomfort. So concerning issues of inclusivity and diversity, what don't you understand? And lastly, what are you afraid to admit? So the last two questions there around inclusivity and diversity and what you are afraid to admit, I've understood that as I've continued in this work of anti-oppression, anti-racism, and power, I've had to be very clear and honest about the things that I don't know. You know, I have to be very clear about the things that I'm kind of like stumbling through. You'll never deepen in this practice of self-awareness and how oppression functions within our experience and how we manifest oppressions within spaces if we're not honest with ourselves. You know, for me, it's been extremely important for me to understand that, like, there are still strands of misogyny in my experience, you know, and I can communicate that, you know, or there are strands of like anti-class stuff, you know, like the ways in which I am very critical, you know, of people of affluency and so forth, you know, those things still come out. And if you occupy this kind of intersectionality, specifically certain identities that are privileged, then it's really easy to form just, you know, internal biases, you know, around that positionality, you know, to judge people with just privileged identities. So we use, you know, I assume that if you're a meditation instructor or a mindfulness instructor, that you're also a practitioner too. So maybe that's not always the case, but if it is the case, then we're using our practice to unpack this, this reality for ourselves. So moving on, so I think it's important for us to kind of just think about what oppression is. And I'm not going to read everything, but I think I'll read some of this. You know, what is oppression? So social oppression is a concept that describes a relationship of dominance and subordination between categories of people in which one benefits from the systematic abuse, exploitation, and injustice directed toward the other. Because social oppression describes relationships between colleagues of people, it should not be confused with the oppressive behavior of individuals. In social oppression, all members of a dominant and subdominant categories participate regardless of the individual attitudes or behavior. So we're talking about social oppression, we're talking about systems, you know, so we're talking about how systems have been created to subordinate, to marginalize groups of people. So in spaces where we're often talking about race, for instance, often find that some people, I often find that like we're actually not communicating because we're actually different groups of people talking about two different experiences of power, you know. So non-white groups often are talking about systematic oppression. White identified groups are often talking about individual oppression, which is very different. And this is what the social oppression work helps us to understand. Yes, we can be individually discriminated against, but are you part of a group that where a system has actually been constructed to keep all members of your group within a certain positionality socially? So we have to understand, and this one realization helped me to have way better conversations about race with people, and it helped me to understand what I'm talking about when I talk about oppression. I'm always thinking, oh, this is systematic, like the society, and then my white friends, approach them and they're like, well, but I was walking down the street and then someone called me a name. I'm as oppressed as you are. Not that, people say that anymore, but, that's really, and now I'm able to say, oh, okay, I'm talking systematic, you're talking individual, and I can actually have a language to look at that. Intersectional theory, for those of us who weren't familiar with it, so intersectional theory was a theory created by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a law professor. And she developed this theory to really talk about how different people have different experiences in the law system. And this intersectional theory is derived from the lives of black women. So she was talking in her early research about, her work with black women, and why black women have different experiences than white men in the legal system. And then from her initial research, intersectional theory kind of emerged. It's really interesting to think about that the law has provided some of these really interesting theories around race. Critical race theory emerges from the law as well as intersectionality. So intersectionality, I understand to be a community of identities, that we're all inhabiting and holding within our own experience. And these identities are expressed differently depending on the context and how we're informed in relationships. We'll do a little bit of work around intersectionality directly. Intersectionality really helped me to understand why I am the person that I am. Why I can be this person now and then I can go home and be another person. Or I can be in other groups and how other identities come to the forefront. Intersectionality also helps us understand how identities intersect and create very different realities for many of us. So it's been really helpful for me to actually just go through and understand, okay, what's the intersectionality of gender and race for me, and to add in class, or to add in health status, and so this helps us to get a kind of peek into how people show up in the ways that they show up. Part of intersectionality is also about identity. So I understand identity to really be narratives that we tell about each other. These narratives, these stories to explain how I am and why I am. And these narratives and stories become challenging, because these can be identities and stories around how disprivileged we are or how privileged we are. And these stories and narratives can also be spun by the larger society, as well. So we're spinning stories about ourselves, the world is spinning stories, and then at some point, with anti-oppression work for the self, we begin to disrupt the ways in which we've internalized the narratives, that society gives us, and we're all actually being storylined, if we can say, by the world. And so again, like I said earlier, I walk into the space, I look at you, and what I'm actually first encountering is my storyline about you. That you look a certain way, you're behaving a certain way, and therefore you are this person. So as I continue, I'm always interrogating that and saying, okay, this is a storyline I'm giving you, but this is probably not your storyline. And I'm trying not to relate to that. So this is where mindfulness is really important. Belonging and disbelonging. And just very quickly, belonging and disbelonging is, how do we belong to a group? How are we disbelonging? I love this kind of basic awareness of when I walk into a space, how do I feel? Do I think I belong here? Or do I think I don't belong here, and why? And what's going on? Then I engage in like a critique of, okay, what's happening in the space? Like how has the space been constructed where I feel uncomfortable or where I feel I don't belong? And teachers, instructors, the person in the front of the room is often at the heart of belonging and disbelonging. How do we as teachers, instructors create belongingness in the way that we, hold space in the room? How do we welcome people into the space? So one of our questions yesterday was examining, or asking ourselves, when we saw people come into the space for the retreat, what did we think? Did we think that they belonged or didn't belong? Did we say, oh, why would this person be interested in a retreat? How we begin to play into those assumptions, those narratives, and actually engage in this energetic exclusivity of different people from spaces. And one of the ways in which we do that is actually by ignoring or actually paying too much attention. So this is something that I've been working with in some of the groups that I work with. It's like, okay, we're practicing this sense of radical welcome, which has a different meaning in different traditions, but radical welcome for me is radical belonging. So when you come into the space, my positionality is that you belong here. That, you're coming into the space, you want something, I'm here to give something, or to offer, to share something, and I want to create community together. But I can definitely take this other end and say, oh, okay, this person's coming in, and I can get really anxious. So for instance, for me, I get anxious when people that I know come into the space for like talks like this, especially people that I've known for a little bit, and that's not anything that has to do with the individual, it has to do with me. And I know if I'm not mindful in the moment, I start actually reacting to that, and that actually disrupts what I'm able to share for the larger group. So know that for yourself. Like, who would walk into a room that completely disrupt you? And sometimes you actually have this experience where the person that you dislike the most in your life is the one that shows up for something. Or like, someone you met somewhere and like you had an experience and you stop talking to them and they show up. Not that it ever happens to me, but like sometimes you're like, oh, I was going to email you, but I know it's been like a year, but like it's still on my list. And I love it when stuff like that happens. Because it forces me to practice on the spot and to go, okay, there's this person here, but I'm actually not here exclusively for this person, I'm here for the group. So these are the various ways of belonging and disbelonging. Intersectionality continued. So again, intersectionality is grounded in feminist theory, especially from the lives of Black women. Diversity components includes everything, like literally every class, race, immigration. I'll get into that a little more in a few slides, but intersectionality and identity is much more complex than we think. Everything. We're building identity on everything. We build our identities on the clothes that we wear, where we do our grocery shopping, what apps we use, all of this is something that we're creating narratives about who and what we are. I'm the kind of person that does this, and uses that, and I only wear whatever, So radical Dharma intersectionality, which I've kind of gone through, but basically, my understanding of intersectionality within my work around radical Dharma is that we're a community of identities, basically. And that's really helped my work in getting into understanding, that my community is always shifting. Different parts of my community is expressing itself differently depending on the context. So I wanted to bring in some work around from my friend and co-writer and colleague, Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, who some of you have heard of. And we're co-authors for Radical Dharma. Her first book, Being Black, is really, it's a very important text around identity, race, and Dharma, if you're a Dharma identified. So this is one of the quotes that she offered to me, and that we actually have in Radical Dharma, and I use actually in different things that I work with. Again, this emphasizes the role of Black women in particular in terms of intersectionality and many social theories, where she basically says that women are the canaries in the coal mine, And so the rest of the interview, so she's giving an interview, and the interviewer stops her, and she's like, "What are you talking about?" And then she goes on, and she says, "Yeah, Black women are the canaries in the coal mine because Black female bodies are more sensitized to oppression and suffering, especially within the social context." So she's giving awareness to the fact that within the lives of Black women, there's an intersectionality that helps us to understand suffering in a different way, especially social oppression. So levels of identity locations. So these levels, is something that I'm kind of toying with, but when I want to communicate in terms of levels is that there are things that we assume upon looking at someone. And then there are things that are more hidden in terms of identity, So this is what I'm kind of playing with in some of this work. So levels of identity, some of the things that we can look and maybe see, race, gender, if you're transgender, cisgender, class, ethnicity, age, sexuality, sex, or intersectionality, looks, desirability, mental health, nationality, ability, education, religion, spiritual practice, political views, and then things that we may not be so apparent, but again, this is all interchangeable. IQ, also emotional quotient, so our emotional maturity, recovery status, popularity, child status, incarceration background, health, immigration status, accent, language, ability, body markings, tattoos, partnership status, authority status, child status. This is actually, you can go on and on. So these are the kinds of things that we're actually spinning narratives about us, and these are the things in which we're actually moving through the world being centered around, and these are really important. Some of these are locations of privilege, some of these are locations of disprivilege, and these are all working intersectionally within our experience. This is why I think it's so important for us in different spaces to work with this, because this triggers a kind of sensitivity to how we're showing up and how others are showing up who are coming into space with us to share space. So the location naming game is just something that I do sometimes if I had more than 2 hours. So I just ask basic questions like, what are my identity locations? What are the locations that have been most painful for me? What are the ones that I experience privilege or disprivilege? Which ones do I experience power over other people? And just on, you just kind of go through that. There are other exercises that we can do with intersectionality. One is called the iceberg exercise, in which we say that, okay, there's this, so with icebergs, right? So they're like, the tip of the iceberg is above water, then the base is below the water. And so the idea is to say, okay, these are the things, the tip of the iceberg that people see initially, but the bulk of the iceberg beneath the water are the things that are not apparent, that actually you would never know unless I disclose that. And these are kinds of things that we're all kind of walking around with, and you would be surprising. You'd be very surprised if you sat with people and people would start sharing these things that you would have never guessed. I have friends, for instance, who are immigrants, And it took me years before I knew that, because of all these other factors of their identity, because they spoke perfect English, because they were so American identified, and all these other things. And then it came to a point, I was like, well, I was actually born somewhere else. And I was like, oh, okay. Again, I'm just creating storylines and narratives and just buying into it, And so we all are holding these narratives that aren't apparent, And how can we kind of open up to that reality, to have that potential of saying, okay, there's someone in front of me, but I'm sure there's much more, On Friday night, I mentioned that like everyone has a secret. I didn't say that I knew the secret, but I asserted that everyone has a secret, and not that identity is a secret, but sometimes certain identities are a secret because certain identities actually are very disprivileged, and we're trying to like bypass that in order to gain privilege and power within certain spaces. So there are all kinds of ways in which we have this tradition of people passing. In many different ways. So Audre Lorde, of course, I can't get through a presentation without Audre Lorde. This is really important, her work around the fear of difference. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And that's really the only part of the quote people ever say. Then the next is, they may also allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. Racism and homophobia are real conditions of all of our lives in this place and time. I urge each one of us here to reach down into that deep place of knowledge inside herself and touch that terror and loathing of any difference that lives here. See whose face it wears. Then the personal as the political can begin to illuminate all of our choices. I love always how Audre Lorde encourages us to go deeper, to uncover these roots, these fear, uncover the things that we're always trying to avoid, because she understands that if we don't do that work, then we continue to create suffering for ourselves and also especially for those around us. So getting into a little bit of power. There's so many definitions and understandings of power. I try to keep it very simple and basic, but the influence and control of others, what we use to get things done. Systematically, a person in a system that has been granted power to influence and control is called an authority. So again, authority isn't this negative word, but it's how authority is used. It's how power is used, or how authority is not used. I think a good example of that is our present, administration in this country is a really perfect case study in power and authority and what's happening and not happening and how leadership is completely absent right now. So I like to look at French and Raven's 5 bases of power, and these are just very classic ways of understanding how power functions. So legitimate power, someone's been granted power, and it's someone who's earned, authority within a group. So like a senior teacher, spiritual director, etc. So there's a formal authority happening. Like you have a title, and then you have this authority. There's also informal authority, where yes, we've been given like a position and authorized, but there's this informal authority space where we're actually not authorized to be over, but we just kind of get. Just like when people do favors for you, are, in a professional sense. They're like, okay, I know you, I'll just do this even though I'm not supposed to. That's informal authority. That's how, we network. Really, that's how some of us get job interviews. It's like, oh, you know someone. Referent power. The ability of individuals to draw others to them because of some aspect of their being, like charisma, talent, beauty. Beauty has a lot of power. It carries a lot of power for us. We tend to follow beautiful people, or people who we consider to be attractive. You know, and it's really interesting to look at that. You know, I often am like, oh, you know, there's this like really attractive person. It's not gender, it's just like, oh, you're aesthetically very pleasing. You know, so I'm going to actually pay more attention to you. You know. So when you see that in a space, you actually have to like disrupt that by looking elsewhere. But that's a real issue for us. Attraction is a real issue that we're dealing with as instructors and teachers. And it's important just to be honest about that. You know, in certain clinical relationships, it's important to go, okay, I'm attracted to this person. There are feelings, you know, that are arising. Okay, you know. So expert power comes from being an expert, you know, expertise in something. You know, if someone has a PhD, then we'll listen to them, you know, and, you know, to an extent. Reward power is the power that comes from, you know, the power that comes from me being able to reward you. You know, so my power is derived from having gifts or paying people. You know, but some of us do sometimes. You know, that's how we get people to do. You know, that's how we get kids to do work. Okay, if you clean up your room, you'll get to do whatever. You know, or you'll get this toy. Coercive power is fear-based power. So if I don't do something, then I'll be hurt. Nuance power, expression, status, and rank. And you kind of read that. Status helps us to understand the nuances within power relationships. And we can make some of these slides available too if people are interested in figure out something. But you can just Google some of this and find it. So power and exertion of force. So from my work, I understand violence as an exertion of force against other people's will, and including the force against my own will. So violence in communities is rooted in the unexamined and unchallenged exertion of power against the will of others, which is not for the benefit of others, resulting in emotional, physical, spiritual woundedness or trauma. So this is kind of like a working definition I'm using right now to understand violence. So one of the things that we're, you know, talking more about, thinking more about is this idea of white privilege. So white privilege, understood as the collection of benefits based on belonging to a group perceived to be white, when the same or similar benefits are denied to members of other groups. It is the benefit of access to resources and social rewards and the power to shape the norms and values of society that white people receive unconsciously or consciously by virtue of their skin color. You know? So white privilege is kind of like this, it's the basis power, this unearned exertion of power over non-white people. Now this is, again, can be conscious and unconscious, you know, but still there's an exertion of power. Power is always at play. Power is always happening, you know, so we can't sidestep the reality of power, you know. And we can also say, you know, we can also use this understanding, this paradigm to talk about gender as well. What we're understanding now with the emergence of this kind of field of study of cisgenderism, you know, cisgender meaning that, you know, you're given a gender at birth, and this is the gender that you agree with as you go, you know, grow older. And there's a privilege with that, you know, so how does that work? You know, living in a society in which you've been granted privilege because of being in this particular gender location. And we are participating in that consciously and unconsciously. So again, this is another, this can be another way for us to create a kind of transparency in ourselves and to say, okay, you know, I may identify as cisgender, and how do I enjoy that? You know, and in that enjoyment, how do I create suffering for others? You know. So this is, as you've kind of figured out, like this kind of anti-oppression is really about us. It's like, how am I reproducing oppression in the space, on the spot, in my relationships, and as a teacher or instructor? How am I just unconsciously reproducing these narratives over and over again? You know, even in how I offer mindfulness instructions. You know. There's a new app, I'll just mention that, and just in case I forget, I'm part of a group of people, we're developing a new app that's actually taking meditation and mindfulness and using it to create exercises around exploring gender. I'm sorry, not gender, identity. Identity in general. You know, so using mindfulness to explore identity locations, and reflections and contemplations and so forth. So I'm actually really excited about this, and I can't wait till it launches. It's going to be just a couple more months before we get it out and going. But this app, and you know, it's like Insight Timer or Headspace or some of these meditation apps that we have out now, where you just listen to it and it'll guide you through, you know, understanding gender, you know, for yourself, class and race, you know, and creating some space around looking into that more critically for yourself. So I wanted to just offer this definition of restorative power, and this is from Letitia Nieto, who's an anti-racism trainer and psychotherapist out on the West Coast, I think in Seattle. She has a book called Beyond Inclusion, Beyond Empowerment. If you're a teacher, any kind of teacher, yoga, meditation, classroom teacher, this is a really nice book to get. It's a little expensive, but it's an investment. This restorative power, a connection to source, wholeness, the sacred. Anyone can be a person of power, regardless of social membership, roles, job, or other external markers. Our authentic center, the person we are when we are aware of and free from the restrictions of rank roles, so a nuance of power relationships. Access to true self in moments when we are aware of status and rank dynamics, and we are able to operate on the anti-oppressive side of the agent and target models. So agent meaning a person of power, target communities meaning marginalized communities are the target of oppression. This has been really important for me to kind of start working with. Again, power is always there. How do I actually take responsibility for the power that I have? You know, and how that taking responsibility also entails me moving into the space where I am basically and simply situated within my experience, and there's this natural interruption of how I'm trying to dominate other people and spaces. You know, how can I have this kind of natural sense of just being myself? You know, and not running away from the insecurities or my unmet needs, or how I'm like sitting with the ways, how I'm actually trying to figure out what it means just to be myself and not to perform something else in order to gain power over other people. So this is the way that I translate it even further. I like to think in images and experiences. So I've used this before already this weekend, but my experience of restorative power is also the experience that I have when I'm in a particular place, a physical place that I feel completely at home in. You know, so you think about that. Where do you feel really at home and whole, you know, and stable? You know, like your happy place. And I'm talking more about a physical place. Like, where's a physical? It can be out in nature. It can be at home. It can be where you grew up. So thinking about that, what does that feel like? And now going further and thinking about, okay, what if I felt like that in my physical body and in my experience in the present moment? Like, I'm just simply at home. You know, if you're simply at home, you realize that you really don't care what's happening outside. You know, you don't care what's happening in someone else's house. When people come to visit you, then you welcome them because you're happy and you're healthy and you're in comfort. You know, so this is what it feels like, I think, to reside in restorative power. And I like that, and of course it takes lots of work to do that practice, this is again where our meditation practice, our mindfulness practice comes into play. We're attempting to cultivate these states for ourselves in the moment. So, moving into some of these ideas around colonizing of the mind, and of course, this for me, it makes me think of Malcolm X, who I think was a really amazing example of the ways in which we can actually go through the process of decolonizing our minds. I think if you're interested in this, of course, reading like decolonization literature is great, but also the autobiography of Malcolm X, to understand how someone in their life, in their lifetime, actually practiced decolonizing of the mind, and that is a process that one engages in. So briefly with some of the work around decolonizing of the mind, so the intervention of an external source, the colonizer, in the mental space, sphere of a subject or a group of subjects, the colonized. So it's a colonizer or a person, a power, a group of power, moving into a certain space and occupying that certain space, and then subjugating that space to the culture and the ideas of the colonizer, the people in power. So we just apply that same understanding to the colonization of the mind, which has often been my experience of meditation instruction. As a recipient, as a student, sometimes, I've been in spaces where I've been told to not think in certain ways, and at the onset, I was like, okay. Then as I've developed my practice, I've been unfortunately able to understand it's like, I've been in spaces where people have asked me not to look at the ways in which I'm really uncomfortable and feeling unsafe, and how if I'm not in tune to that, that actually creates problems for me because I'm bypassing, So as teachers, sometimes if we instruct people to hold space for that, to look at like these difficult things that are coming up in your mind, then we feel as if we have to take responsibility for that. So the easiest thing to do is to say, okay, this is, go somewhere else, like bypass that, do something else, It's extremely detrimental. But moving on, the intervention affects aspects of the mind structure, mode of operation, and content. So people are definitely traumatized meditating. That's actually a reality. There are actually programs that actually provide resources for traumatized meditators. And so you think, if I start meditating, I'll be happier and whatever else. And some people actually have this experience of being, like re-traumatized really intensely. And that creates a block to accessing meditation resources. Our early introduction of meditation in this country, happening, it's been happening for a while, but particularly in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we had, meditation teachers coming, Asian, meditation teachers, but also Westerners who trained with Asian teachers teaching meditation, and was really very little sensitivity to trauma. I mean, of course, this is the 50s and 60s and 70s, so our literature around trauma wasn't so available, So we had teachers who were just like, okay, just push through it and just be with it and just sit with it and, all this other stuff. And what you realize is that people were really being traumatized and re-traumatized. So you have this early kind of group of meditators in this country who are just kind of like, deeply wounded, but it continues to happen. And this happens because of, we have meditation teachers who really aren't trained in trauma sensitivity, who actually may be really new to their practice, so they may have gone to like, if you're a mindfulness teacher, gone to like, I don't know, an 8-week course, and then you come out and you're like a mindfulness teacher. So the problem is that you're not a teacher. You're a mindfulness instructor, and so we actually invest a lot of like referent power into these teachers, and then we're getting hurt, or at least we're not having any benefit from our practice. So you have to have a kind of agency. You have to actually say, okay, this is the instruction I'm getting. Is this really healthy for me? Is this really conducive for me? You know, is this instruction encouraging me to bypass something, or is it encouraging me to look at something? And if the instruction is to look at something, how am I being instructed to look at it? Is it in a way that actually makes me feel worse? Or is it in a really sensitive way that helps me to manage what's coming up for me in the moment? You know, so meditation teachers, mindfulness instructors often do not have to go through any kind of like trauma sensitivity training. Not that I know of. The trainings that I'm involved in for teachers do. You know, you get all of this. Trauma training, anti-oppression training, you know, the whole thing. So its effects are long-lasting and not easily removable. Again, if you're traumatized in meditation, likely you won't be going back to meditate or do anything. There's a marked asymmetry of power between the parties involved. So basically, there's an imbalance of power between two parties. So one person has power, another person doesn't. Again, I as the teacher or instructor am exerting this power over you. You know, if you're an amazing teacher, an amazing instructor, then like great. You know, if you're not so great. Not so great for people getting instruction. The parties can be aware or unaware of their role of colonizer or colonized. So just to put that really simply, we're not aware. You know, so we're not really aware of this relationship in spaces like this. And so colonized is a word and also a field of study that I actually think is really critical and important right now. You know, and people say, well, some of these words and you know, but this is the reality of what's happening, you know, for many of us in positions of power and those who are not in positions of power. As a person who often has come through spaces where I feel disempowered, I've often felt very colonized. And as a person, a black person, a black American who was trained in my particular field of Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, I definitely feel colonized. You know, and I was using that language well before like I started studying any of this. You know, I felt very much like someone was moving into my body and mind and kicking everything out and telling me to replace that with this system of practice, which was deeply cultural, and the work wasn't being done to, you know, extract the cultural from the practice. You know, so if we're students within traditions that are coming from a mother country or from a culture outside of, you know, this country, we have to really do the work of understanding what's cultural and what's practice. You know, and so, and this is how I practice agency as a teacher. You know, in my positionality, I understand, okay, this is cultural, this is practice. You know, but a lot of people aren't doing that kind of discernment. And so lastly, both can participate in the process voluntarily or involuntarily, this is a tricky part because sometimes we don't actually know that we're being colonized, you know, until like, at least if you're like me, you wake up and you're like, wait, I'm not myself anymore. What happened? You know, what's happening in this space? It can be a yoga space. You know, same thing happens in those spaces as well. It's like, okay, what am I being told to believe and engage in that's actually antithetical to like who I am within my intersectionality? That's why we have, for instance, like people of color spaces. You know, I know there's always a little bit of pushback around that sometimes, but you know, we have to create spaces where our intersectionalities are seen, privileged. You know, within radical Dharma work, we are always trying to create spaces that center the experiences of marginalized communities. That doesn't exclude any other community, but we want to center unheard voices and how we create communities and sitting spaces and meditation spaces and retreats and so forth. So I want to get a little bit into microaggressions, and I want to get more into some components of mindfulness teaching and just offer some suggestions there. So microaggressions and microinequities. So good people can do bad things, you know. So these are the ways in which we're hurt, in which we can't determine what was right or wrong about it, and there's no formal grievance. These happen, microaggressions happen in spaces, often through words, through actions that may have not be perceived by other people in the space. You know, so microaggressions against people within marginalized identities or disprivileged identities, and these are something within a university setting, like, you know, like here, like any university, it happens often in the classroom, you know, through, you know, the lack of awareness of the professor or through how classrooms are managed and maintained. So microaggressions, again, tiny damaging characteristics of an environment. They're, you know, comments, they can be work assignments, tone of voice, failure to acknowledge. There are these really subtle indicators of a lack of respect by virtue of a membership of a group. So it's this kind of like lack of awareness of how we're interacting with people. So I'm going to kind of move through internalized biases just for now and get into microaggressions and mindfulness teaching. So these are some of the things that I've just kind of been collecting. This is very anecdotal, you know, kind of collection here. So first, you know, how do we practice microaggressions as mindfulness teachers and mindfulness teaching? And again, you can apply this if you're a yoga teacher or any other kind of teacher. So first, considering our experience as the right experience. So I was very much guilty of this in my early teaching and saying, okay, if you're not having this experience, then you're wrong. You know, so if you're feeling bad right now and I'm teaching you loving kindness, then like you're wrong. Because loving kindness is supposed to make you feel really good. Obviously it doesn't, right? So again, you shift the language and you say, okay, whatever you're having, whatever experience you're having right now is the experience you're supposed to be having. You know, so how do we bring awareness to what's happening now, and how do I help you support that, what's happening for you in the moment? So example, you know when you blank and that feels blank. So I hear this all the time. So when people say, well, you know, like when you're like, you know, doing something, you feel like whatever, you know, and sometimes I sit there, I'm like, no. Like, first of all, I don't do what you do. And so I can't feel like what you feel because I don't do what you do. But you can open that language up. You know, it's often when I'm working with these instructions, it's very it's like I say, oh, when I do this, I feel like this. You know, and I always try to connote this understanding of that, like, okay, what's similar for you, or like, what do you do? And understanding that we're all having different experiences, you know. Asserting that there are only certain ways to experience teachings, you know. Again, I'm in spaces where I don't even get the teachings, you know, and other people walk out and they're like, that's amazing. You know, I'm like, what? You know, I'm like, I don't get it, you know, I don't get that instruction. And the ways in which we make people feel bad for that. You know, I can't believe you didn't get that. Those are really basic, simple teaching. But there's so many different ways to experience teaching. How do we create space for people to have that experience? So advocating for a pure Dharma. And Dharma is a word that I use to, you know, not just about Buddhist teachings, but, you know, just instruction in general. So advocating there's a pure Dharma. So saying that there's only one way to do this. You know, and there's an authentic, orthodox, pure thing. And if we corrupt that at all, then it's not Dharma anymore. You know, so if that were the case, then I wouldn't be ever doing pure Dharma because I don't do anything orthodox, you know, and straightforward. Again, you know, what I am experiencing, when I begin to work through intersectionality is to understand that the practice of mindfulness or the practice of Dharma actually comes through my experience, and it comes out through my intersectionality. So it's like a prism. So the sun, shines through the prism, and the prism breaks that light into like these different rays, these different rainbow rays. And that's how I think Dharma is, being experienced and being, we're learning these teachings, we're doing these practices, and then we're translating them depending on where we're at in our intersectionality. So often in my training, I was, taught that, okay, this is the way that you teach Dharma, and you have to do it exactly the way your teachers did it. So my primary teacher was a Tibetan man in his late 70s. I'm not going to reproduce that because I'm not a Tibetan man in my late 70s. So I threw that out the window early on, because I couldn't replicate that. We're being asked to be something other than what we are, and when we bypass who we are, then I think that creates the causes and conditions for misconduct to start, because there's a way that we're bypassing our experience, and within that ambiguity that arises, then anything can happen, Like I have to be situated within my intersectionality to know how power is working in my relationships. If I don't understand power, then I become insensitive to it and I begin to do things that hurt people. So not acknowledging the range of experiences within the room. Again, just like, hey, what's happening in the room? Everyone's having a different experience. That's great. I'm not threatened by that. So sometimes we're teachers, we go into spaces and we're like, okay, if everyone doesn't achieve enlightenment by the end of the session, then like I suck as a teacher, No, like that's not necessarily our role. Our role is to communicate and to transmit these instructions, and then people have to work with it on their own. From working with it on our own, like we have these different experiences. So we practice where we're at, So we have to really understand that, like, it's okay that everyone has a different experience. Everyone right now is having a different experience. I'm having a different experience. I'm like, oh, I'm talking too much, and, I'm tired of using PowerPoint when I really, like, want to get off of it, and do something else. But that's my experience, and it's okay. Like, it's not a big deal, And I invite you to have your experiences. So lastly, with this slide, viewing discomfort as not part of practice. Again, some of us, when we start contemplative-based practices, we seem to hurt a lot, which is awesome. That means you're doing something right, That means that, like, we're actually uncovering these experiences that we've been avoiding, So it's not that we're creating more pain and suffering, it's that we're actually tuning into what's already there and happening. And that was my experience in my early meditation practice, My very, very early meditation practice when I could only sit for like a minute. And then after a minute, I was running out the room, And then I did it for like a couple of weeks, and then I was like, this sucks. Like every time I try to do meditation, I seem to be like in a lot of pain, a lot of emotional pain, But it wasn't until I came back to the practice after about a year or so that I was like, oh, okay, this is actually what should be happening. I'm just becoming aware of what's there. And then I can use all these other methodologies. I can use counseling. I can use, other therapies and other supplementary contemplative practices to help me work with the pain that comes up. But the basic project of meditation is to be aware. And then after that, I have to choose other ways of working with what is uncovered. So microaggressions and mindfulness teaching, and this is more specifically for facilitating space. So failing to acknowledge different people in the room, we've talked about that. Normalizing your experience and acting out of that normalization. So one kind of method that I do, I haven't actually done this since I've been here this weekend, but actually often I'll open up a teaching by asking people to kind of identify where they're coming from. So basically like if you identify as a Buddhist or a practitioner, if you do yoga or contemplative practices, or you don't do anything, that helps me get a sense of who's in the room in terms of like practice and tradition. And that helps me to kind of guide my work. I'm just assuming that people are a little bit interested in this, and that's the assumption that I'm working on right now. So I hope that assumption is correct. So failing to recognize visitors, I always love to like welcome visitors into the space. If you're like new, usually if I'm a visiting teacher, I'm a visitor too, but like I always say, well, I don't live here, but welcome, you know, into the space. And you can do that. If you're guest teaching somewhere, you can do that. You know, I think that's fun to do. Assuming that everyone is comfortable and everyone isn't comfortable, you know, and that's important for us to recognize. Assuming resistance is personal. So assuming that if I'm like struggling with a practice, or assuming that if someone else is struggling with a practice, then it's my fault. You know, that has everything to do with me. You know, and maybe it has everything to do with what that person is experiencing in the moment, the things that they're bringing into the space, preoccupations, have nothing to do with what you're doing. And not listening deeply, again, which can be quite challenging, and this not listening deeply is something that we're always doing in our relationships, especially in these spaces. I would say not listening deeply and just also not looking deeply as well. You know, looking meaning like I'm not seeing beyond these surface narratives and storylines that I'm preoccupied with about people. So strategies in supporting anti-oppression mindfulness teaching. Cultural humility, just basic. How do we develop sensitivity to aspects of different cultures? Components of cultural humility. And I think these are just really basic components that we can engage in regardless of what we're doing. So lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique. And I encourage people not only to do this on your own, but to be within communities and support groups. You know, and working with mentors, but also, you know, groups of colleagues, you know. Like it's so important that, you know, if something comes up, that you have a group of people who are in your position to kind of run things by. You know, if you're in meditation and mindfulness, this is incredibly important. So a desire to fix power imbalances, again, is always looking at power, evaluating power. Develop partnerships with people and groups who advocate for others. So allyship, you know, is one way that I could describe that. Comradeship. There are a couple of things I just kind of want to share around how we move through dissonance. So dissonance, disequilibrium, are just the sense of just being unsettled, and how we actually move within spaces or teach within spaces where, you know, we're getting this really unsettled feedback. So the room is like really unstable, you know. So you've hit into some really difficult material. And how, as a teacher, how do we hold space for that? Because we can really deeply internalize that, and that can really disrupt the holding environment. You know, so the teacher is primarily responsible for maintaining this holding space. So if the teacher isn't maintaining the space, the boundaries, the container is weakened, and then people lose confidence and trust, and the work, you know, can't be done. You know, there's nothing this effective that's happening in the space any longer. So as a teacher, you know, as you see, so it spells out be aware. Yeah. It is clever. So first of all, just simply being. You know, I'm just being in my body, being in my experience, just recognizing that. Embodying is also a part of that. Just like, okay, how am I coming into my body? My body is actually giving me a lot of signals, a lot of messages about how I'm reacting and being in the space. Being aware of all of that, and plus what's going on around me, you know. Witnessing, how am I able to step back and take like a, you know, sometimes we say you step onto the balcony, but how can I get like some space so I can actually take this really more holistic view of what's happening in my body, what's happening in my mind, what's happening in spaces. Accepting, you know, how can I just allow that to simply be? Because it is there, it is happening. So how can it just be there? Reflect. You know, how am I reflecting? How am I using my reflecting to actually figure out what to do next. And lastly, engaging is actually the doing. Like, how do I engage in this moment after having gone through this series of reflections and practices? So this is something that I always kind of work with on my own. And this is something that I think that if we don't have, as teachers, instructors, if we don't have practices around this, then we're easily thrown off in spaces. And people within the space, students, actually see that and begin to respond to that. And the holding environment begins again to be challenged. So understanding trauma and student dissonance. So again, when things begin to get tapped into, we actually start taking this personal responsibility for it. But we can actually develop these tools just like the ones we did for being aware or be aware. So understanding trauma and that basic instructions like body sensory and breath anchoring can be triggering for some people. So, trauma sensitivity, like, it took like a period of people coming to me after leading meditation instructions for them to tell me, okay, you triggered me. And I was like, oh, please tell me, like, how did I do that? And then people would just say, okay, because of the breath makes me feel really unstable. There's no foundation with breath. Or, I have body trauma that I can't actually look at and that really triggers me. And so it's helped me to actually have trauma sensitivity and to study this a little more to understand how I can create spaces where, I may actually be given breath instructions or body sensory instructions, but I'm also giving instructions to people that allow them to practice agency and to say, okay, if this is a problem, here's something else. So I can't stop giving breathing meditation and body sensory, but I can always offer alternatives. Just like in yoga practice, we offer, what is it called? The modifications, right. So we can offer modifications in meditation instruction. So understanding the ways in which internalized oppression manifests, and we've been talking about this, helps students cultivate mindfulness skills when feeling dissonance. So again, like, okay, you feel uncomfortable. Okay, let's look at what's happening. Don't avoid it, but look at it. And let's look at it in a way that's kind and patient and doesn't re-traumatize. Helps students name dissonance. So I love when people articulate this. Like, what are you feeling? How are you feeling it? And lastly, embrace messiness. Again, we avoid the messiness, but messiness is very productive. Dissonance, I equate dissonance and messiness together, but it can mean separate things. But messiness is like the ways in which we don't have everything together, but we're moving forward, and how you can actually learn a lot from that kind of movement. So deep listening for dismantling privilege, recognizing the Shempa, which is a Tibetan word for fixation. So we're recognizing how our mind gets tight. Like when we're trying to address the ways in which we're benefiting, we always get really defensive and say, well, I'm not privileging, but that's our mind closing down and shutting down. So recognizing that, if you're doing that work for yourself, and refraining from scratching, basically meaning refraining from trying to figure it out on the spot, trying to okay, what's going on, because that creates a lot of anxiety and that actually complicates the work of looking. Relax. So with relaxing, we can refrain from scratching, and just be with it, be with this kind of deep discomfort around some of the privileges that you enjoy. And resolve. So you resolve to interrupt the momentum like this for the rest of your life. So you're making this aspiration that, okay, this is what's happening. I'm going to commit myself to disrupting the ways in which I privilege. And lastly, and I'll stop here and open up for questions, working with privilege being called out. So this explains the last slide a little more, but notice what gets stirred up. Don't react. initially. Just watch your mind. So this happens, so we talked yesterday about the calling out culture, I think, or someone in some group. I've had a lot of group conversations. And so we talked about how difficult being called out is. And some of us have been called out. I've been called out, too, especially around ageism, too. So this is really particularly very helpful for me. So you just notice what gets stirred up, what's triggered for you, and don't react. Just watch your mind. It's easy to say, to start reacting and getting defensive, but if someone comes up to you and they say, listen, I think what you just said was really racist, then you're like, okay, how can you hold space for that initial shock, that initial push, And that's the first step. It's not to shut down, but to try to open up to what has just been communicated. So secondly, take time and ask for it. Be curious. Get used to this feeling. So it's okay to be like, okay, you've just come to me with this. Can I just get a few moments? Can I get just a little bit of space? And if someone said that to me, if I was calling them out, I would actually I would trust that, So for me, that means that they're taking it seriously. They're respecting this. Third, listen to yourself and the person speaking. Practice understanding what the other person is saying. The other person is not there to educate, but to communicate what is coming up for them in the present. So it's easy to bypass doing this work as someone being called out by asking someone or the person calling you out to do all this emotional labor on your behalf. I'm often in this position, and this is why I get really serious about boundaries. I'm only there to communicate what my experience of this thing was for you. I'm not here to take responsibility or to forgive you for this. We have to sit with whatever sadness and guilt that comes up around this for us. So again, watch what comes up, do not react. Again, continuing to hold space for what comes up and cultivate the witness. So again, you're stepping back and you're just looking, what's happening in my body, what's happening in my mind, how am I attaching, how am I closing down, looking at the ways in which, as we explained in the last slide, looking at the ways in which I'm trying to scratch. How can I just allow the itch to be there? Just like we would do on the meditation cushion or informal practice, you get stung by a mosquito, this has actually happened, and you're there watching and feeling what that whole experience is. And sometimes I've actually, if a mosquito's landed on my arm or something or my hand, I've actually just challenged myself to just look at what's happening. You learn a lot, because the little mosquito puts a little thing in, and they suck up a little blood and they run away, then the bump comes. It's that's science. Then you ask yourself, okay, this is calling out. This is really what calling out is being. It feels like it feels like getting stung, and you watch that bump rise, and that bump is just our resentment, our unwillingness to be there. But we can just hold space and just let it be there, and rise, and we don't have to scratch it. It's amazing training to hold that kind of space for ourselves. But if you're interested in actually being an ally or a comrade or, whatever we want to identify ourselves as, this is what our work is. Is holding space for the ways in which we're being educated by the space. Particularly in the ways in which we create suffering for those in the space, unknowingly and knowingly. So I will take questions and comments. I feel so bad with this PowerPoint, but I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I feel like a college student. I feel like a college professor. Speaking of hating authority, actually my college professors aren't this organized. Quite honestly, no one uses a slide. They're like, oh, I have some notes somewhere, but I'm just gonna talk for 2 hours. Yes.
While we're doing the questions.
What's that now?
Turn the slide thing off while we're doing the questions.
I don't know how to do that. What's that now?
Oh, there's just a question about whether or not people can have copies.
Sure. Sure, yeah. This isn't copywritten. Except for, oh yeah. Yeah, there's a lot more to this, but you can have the whole thing, you know. So I'm going to cut this off. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's okay.
Let's see, do I was going to do that. It's not working. Okay, there we go. Sometimes you can't cut them off because the lens will crack, but maybe this is from the 90s. I just know back in high school, like we couldn't touch these because the school was like, if you touch it and turn it off, the lens will crack and you'll have to pay for it. I'm like, no, I won't. I have legal right to free education, so you're gonna pay for it. Anyhow, yes, I'm sorry. Any questions? Yes, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm so distracted.
So, just ahead of time, excuse the kind of semi-formal question, but I have this kind of things forming around about kind of the culture here at UVM of allyship and ego, and how I think that, you know, being here for 4 years, I've noticed a lot of students who take on self-assumed identity as an ally, and you know, being a good ally involves giving up a lot of things if you're a person like me of privilege. But I feel like a lot of times there's like an ego trap, and how we talk about ego traps and like meditation, how we can be like, I'm very meditator, I feel like there's an ego trap in being an ally as well, where you assume an identity of like, I know how to be an ally. And like, I don't know if you've thought about that or anything, or just like, you touched on that before in your own thoughts, but.
Oh yeah. We talk about this in Round of the Dharma too. This is a book that I have to co-write as well. But yes, it's cool to be an ally. It's hot, it's sexy, and this is what all the kids are doing. And with allyship, a lot of communities are actually challenging that word. So on my end, and kind of the communities that I work with, we're using terminology more like co-conspirator, comrade. I like comrade personally, because it makes people uncomfortable. So my understanding of comradeship and comradeship and co-conspiratorship really is about disrupting this kind of idea of allyship and encouraging people to go to their front lines, to their edges, and do their work. If you're doing your work to disrupt oppression in your own experience, then you are doing the work of allyship. So it's not about you showing up to the meetings necessarily. It's not about you wearing the t-shirts, and claiming an identity. It's about you doing the work of disrupting how you're creating suffering within the system for others. Often that's the work that the inner work that people are really doing. Trying to do being an ally. So being an ally is, again, it's more than just showing up to the meeting and going to the march and wearing Black Lives Matter shirts. It's really about how, in these really intense ways, do I still devalue the lives of people of color? How do I continue to play that devaluing out in the ways that I think, speak, and act? How am I not actually taking being called out seriously and taking feedback from marginalized groups seriously? So you figure out where your work is and you go to it. So it's not about being behind me, it's not about supporting my stuff. Particularly in terms of race, like white people who are doing this work are very noticeable. Like there's a sense of like, okay, I am doing my best to get on top of this. And I'm moving within communities of color and I'm listening. I'm not trying to go to the front of the room. I'm not trying to talk on behalf of the people. I'm just there, holding space. So in Radical Dharma, in my Sangha, the collective around Radical Dharma, our Sangha, our collective, we call our Sangha a collective. our collective is, established from the views and voices of marginalized communities. So like people of color, queer, immigrant, differently abled and so forth. And when, white people come into this space, there's a sense of like, okay, I'm here, and actually as we talk about this restorative power, there's a sense of like a practice of being in all of their bodies, and that feels really restorative in spaces. Yeah. So when you don't, you can, yeah, there's a lot more to say. Like basically, like Al, I should reword it right now. I think it's really watered down and it really helps people bypass doing really difficult work of challenging internalized oppression and systematic oppression. So showing up to the meeting is not doing the work, basically. Yeah.
I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about colonizing the mind. I found that very provocative, and I may have missed the connection, but you made the distinction between recognizing what's cultural and recognize versus practice.
Yeah.
I think. Can you say some more about how you make that distinction? And I think you're referring to as a teacher. Is that right?
I'm sorry.
Are you referring to yourself as a teacher when you make this distinction between know and its cultural versus practice? I just missed that whole.
Oh, when I refer to myself as a teacher?
When you were doing the colonizing of the mind slide, and we were talking about that, you made the distinction between recognize what's cultural versus what's practice. And I lost the connection there, so I'd just like to hear some more about that.
Yeah. I take this really directly from being trained within a lineage, a tradition that does not originate in this country. So most of my training is from Asian-born teachers. And so during my training, what I was able to really understand was that like so much of what I was being taught was very cultural. It's like, oh, this is how you act. This is how you relate to people. This is what you wear. And all of this is about being a meditator or a Buddhist. So as I've discerned that, what I've been able to understand is that actually, there's this basic practice instruction, and this basic practice instruction is about awareness of mind. And so that's really the point, and that sometimes we get confused with performing the cultural aspects, and it has nothing to do with practice. So sometimes we're not even practicing, but we're just going through these cultural performances of a tradition. And so when we get back to practice itself, then I think that's the expression of what I would call a pure dharma. So sometimes it's easy to get criticized. For me, it's easy to get criticized. Oh, you're like this Tibetan teacher, but you don't wear red or rose or like, all this fabric and stuff. And I made a choice to stop wearing all of that. I never really wore robes, but I used to wear, the shawl and everything, like in the case of teacher. And I was like, this doesn't have anything to do with practice. And plus it's like, especially in the summer, I don't want all this extra fabric. Plus it's not authentic. Sometimes I wear it, for ceremonies and so forth. But actually what I'm doing here is the point of what my training was. It's not for me to pretend like I'm a Tibetan. I'm black, so I've already been colonized. So I'm trying to do uncolonization. And then I enter into this other culture. I was like, oh, I know exactly what's happening. But with like white people, this is like, they love that. They're like, oh, I'm going to get right into this, because whiteness is also about assimilating and appropriating. And that's important to say that. So I was really not into like appropriating. I had enough on my plate to begin with being black, right? So that's what I mean. That's the differentiation.
Okay, thank you.
I think same thing can happen in mindfulness if you're doing like really pure mindfulness, but really like traditional mindfulness. If you're actually studying the roots of mindfulness, which is the Satipatthana, the 4 foundations of mindfulness. If you're taking these teachings from some of these root cultures, which would be like Sri Lankan teachers, Thai teachers, and so forth, and the Theravada tradition, there's also an etiquette that comes with that as well that people are about, which I just never get. I just want to be taught before foundations, not your culture. But it's not for our teachers to discern that because they don't know. Like this is all together for them. It's not their fault. It's actually the work that we have to do in unpacking that. So my teachers don't have to. They don't get that. So.
Great, thank you.
I have two more in the back and will come up.
Yeah, some of us have gotten really good at knowing how to make people feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Without losing them completely.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Curious if if any ways we can practice how to consider not losing someone.
Yeah. So disruptors. So this practice of disrupting. If we're coming from a place of anger, then it's easy for people to shut off. It's easy for me to shut off. If someone comes into a space and they're like just yelling at me, I'm like, nope. But we can intervene within a space and we can do it through this sense and through this embodiment of a kind of love. So I've been called out and made uncomfortable quite a bit, but it's also been really explicitly, there's this energetic reality, there's this intention where it's like, I'm doing this because I want you to be better, not because I'm angry. You can be angry, but I'm really doing this because I want you to stop reproducing violence, not because I'm responding to the violence that I'm internalizing. And I've seen this happen over and over again, like this example. So this is an example that I like to use because I think about it all the time. A couple of years ago, I was on the train and subway in Boston. This is before I really started practicing. So the train stops, of course the etiquette, for public transportation is like the train stops, people are allowed to get off, and then people are allowed to come in. That's the way it's supposed to work. So in this particular case, there was a woman, there's a woman of color, who was waiting to get off. The door opens and these young kids just run in. They're teenagers, right? So these teenagers run in, and kind of like knock her a little bit. They run into her. And so they all run in, take seats and whatever. She walks off. Then a second later, she walks back in and holds the door open. And I was like, uh-oh. Like, it's just about to happen now. Like, I was waiting for her to lose it. And quite honestly, I was hoping she would. Because it was like obviously, wrong, right? No, she just holds the door. Of course, when the door in Boston is different, like you can just keep the door open and the train doesn't move. When I lived in DC, the door would take her arm off. I wish that could happen in Boston. Anyhow, so she just kept the door open. She was like, listen, she's found the kid. She was like, listen, I know you wanted to get on the train. I get that. I hear that. But like I was standing here and you kind of knocked me over. And I just wanted to let you know that. I wanted to communicate, that wasn't cool. And you may not care, you may not understand. But I just want to let you know because, maybe you'll knock someone else down and they're not going to take it lightly, So I'm just trying to educate you. And she said it exactly like that. And she walked off. I was like, okay, there's a lot of love there. Like she could have totally went on, but I think they heard that. Because basically she was like, listen, I'm just trying to create awareness because, someone else would have done something different. So that's how I approach disruption in spaces. Like, listen, I'm doing this because this is what I see happening. I'm committed to people dismantling violence, and I just want to bring this awareness. And I have that intention. Sometimes, I raise the volume a little bit. But I know that that invites people into considering it, at least planting seeds for that. Yelling people anger is the first thing that turns people off. Unfortunately. no matter how passionate, no matter how right you are, it's about how we deliver the message. You know, it's just like, I wish it wasn't the case. I wish that people could just like express themselves as openly, as directly as possible, you know, but we have to be skillful. And what else?
Yeah, talk about that.
The skillful part? The skillful part is about being aware.
Okay.
Like, it's not about responding and responding to what comes up for us in the moment. It's like, it's not about getting pissed off, right? And just like losing it. And this is the way I used to do it. I used to get pissed off and just be like, I'm about to tell you. You know? But now I experience getting angry, feeling angry, then I allow that to rise. And I'm like, okay, I'm pissed off. But what do I want to happen now? You know, if my goal is just to like yell at someone and not care about anything transformative happening, sure, just do it. You know, but if I'm trying to like call out behavior and actions, and if I'm in a space to do that, then I have to like actually do it skillfully. You know, my anger can inform the way in which I intervene. I can't respond to it. I can't respond out of it. I can respond out of the intent to help educate people. So that takes a lot of work to do that. And this, for me, that was grounded in meditation. Actually, my first project in meditation was actually holding space for anger. Okay. Let me, what's the time? Just check. Okay. Okay. So we have to end right at 12. I'm sorry, unfortunately. I'm notorious for going over. So I'll take one more question. Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry.
I'm done. You kind of hinted at this, but I wondered if your commitment to this work, the anti-depression work and love and mindfulness, like how do you take care of yourself?
Yeah.
I know sometimes there's a cumulative impact and, you know, being in the trenches of this work, it can take a toll on you and just sort of how to sustain yourself.
I don't go to every meeting. I don't go to every march or every rally. I know how to say no. So those are basic boundaries. And then beyond that, I have these rituals or practices that I'm engaged in. So I'm trying to figure out, you know, what rest looks like, what nutrition looks like. I'm trying to engage in modalities, you know, like energy work, body work. I'm a Reiki practitioner myself. Like all kinds of like very indigenous ritual-based practices that I'm connecting to. You know, they're African ritual-based practices. They're like Native American practices that, and within communities of people who are exploring that together. And this is part of our work in our collective in Boston. We're actually having a half-day retreat where we're inviting practitioners of color into the space to offer their modalities to people. So we're trying to like instill that ethic into the activist community in Boston and provide spaces for that. So I think all of that, you know, taking a break, sitting in silence, and not taking responsibility for other people's work. That's going to slow you down. It's going to make you seem really ineffective, but it's actually going to make you more sustainable to do that. Yeah. And to be okay with having fun, and to also refocus on the joy. You know, it's easy to lose sight, you know, especially now, it's like always something happening, but there are things that we can be grateful for. So, thank you. And one more.
So you talked a lot about discomfort,
Yeah.
and that's a massive part of my own practice.
Yeah.
It's probably the most important part. And it just, you know, you brought up re-traumatizing folks. And I don't know if you touched on it, and I don't know that, but it seems like there's probably a fine line between encouraging sitting with discomfort and re-traumatizing folks.
It is a fine line, yeah, and I try to encourage people, okay, if you're looking at something, trying to hold space for it, and if you know that this is getting too much, then go somewhere else. Like, you know, I call it changing your channel, but it's actually like distracting yourself. You know, and then referring back to a kind of more grounding practice, you You know, that's why I focus on, you know, the body, like particularly weight of the body and the floor. And often, sometimes we use our hands, so people can actually focus on the palms of the hands in terms of like being triggered. And but I always give people this option because people often don't take the agency, they don't practice the agency of doing something different than what the instructor is telling them to do. Again, I'm hard-headed, so I'm always like, well, I'm just going to negotiate this, you know, like I don't feel like doing this, I'm going to do something else, you know, I'm really lazy. But when I'm getting instruction, I always give different ways of working with people. You know. Some of us are really, you know, I work with trauma in my own experience, and so like I have worked with a car, so I can do like, it's kind of tough sitting through things, you know, but some people can't. So I always let people know that they can do whatever they need to do in practice. But thank you, everyone. I have to end.